A couple of months ago, I moved into what I thought was the perfect little flat. It's in a quiet part of town with big windows that let in loads of light and just enough space for me to start fresh. It felt like my little sanctuary. For the first week or so, everything was great, unpacking, decorating, meeting the neighbors, and just enjoying the excitement of having my own place. It was during that first week that I noticed a man in the house directly across from mine. I'd often spot him through his window in the evenings, just sitting there, watching. He'd stand by his window in the dark, face barely lit by the streetlights. I wasn't sure if he could see me, but it felt like he could. I told myself he was probably just someone who kept to himself, but it still made me feel uneasy. The sightings became regular. Every evening, sometimes even during the day, he'd be there. I never saw him doing anything else, just standing, watching from his window. I tried to brush it off, maybe lonely or eccentric, and told myself it was harmless. But then, the notes started appearing. The first one I found was slipped under my door one evening when I got back from work. It was a small, neatly folded piece of paper with just a few words scrawled in a shaky hand. "You look beautiful in that blue dress today." I froze. I'd been wearing a blue dress that day. Maybe one of my neighbors was trying to flirt in some creepy, old-fashioned way, so I tried to shrug it off. But then the next day, another note appeared. "The plant on your windowsill is lovely. You have such a nice touch with decorating." I'd just bought a small plant and placed it in the window that morning. My stomach turned. I looked out of the window, seeing that man in the window again. This time he waved at me, a slow wave. I knew it was him sending me these notes. This wasn't some harmless observation. It felt like he was watching every move I made. I started closing my curtains as soon as I got home, avoiding looking out the window in case I'd see him staring back at me. But somehow, he always seemed to know. The notes kept coming, each one mentioning specific details that no one should know. "Red lipstick suits you." "I see you're cooking tonight." I was getting panicked now. How was he seeing these things? Even with the curtains shut, he seemed to know everything I did. I started to feel trapped in my own flat, constantly looking over my shoulder and checking the windows. One night after another note had been pushed through, I'd had enough. I decided to confront him. I wanted to end this game, whatever it was. I waited until I gained the courage, then marched across the road up to the house where I'd seen him so many times. When I knocked on the door, there was no answer. I peered in through the window, calling out. Nothing. I was about to leave, assuming he was out, when I noticed that the entire place looked empty. There was no furniture, no signs of anyone living there. Confused, I walked around the side of the house to a window that looked into the room where I'd seen him standing night after night. But when I peered inside, there was nothing. Just an empty room covered in a thick layer of dust. I felt a chill run through me. The place looked like it hadn't been lived in for years. I decided to ask a neighbor on the way back, hoping for some rational explanation. They told me that the house had been empty for ages. Apparently, the previous tenant had passed away several years ago, and no one had moved in since. I went back to my flat, feeling cold all over, clutching the latest note he'd left. I spent the rest of the night in the corner of my room, lights off, curtains shut tight. The worst part, that night, there was another note waiting for me in the morning, slipped neatly under my door. "I miss seeing you at the window tonight." I work night shifts as a cashier at a 24-hour supermarket, and normally it's pretty uneventful. It's mostly quiet with a handful of regulars, people grabbing a quick meal on their way to work or home. But a few weeks ago, I started noticing someone. He just seemed like an odd customer. A man in his late 40s or 50s, always in the same coat, slowly pacing up and down the aisles without picking up a single item. Every time I glanced over, there he was, roaming the store, staring at the shelves, as if he were looking for something, but he never did any actual shopping. He'd walk through my line of sight, back and forth, always leaving before getting close to the checkout counter. This went on night after night. I started to get that uncomfortable feeling you get when you know someone's looking at you, even if you're not looking at them. I'd catch him out of the corner of my eye, standing at the end of an aisle, just staring in my direction. He'd hold my gaze if I looked over and then disappear back into the aisles. It was unsettling, but I tried to ignore it. Last week, he escalated. I was finishing up my shift, and as I walked out to the car park, I felt like someone was watching me. Sure enough, as I got closer to my car, I spotted him standing right at the edge of the car park, under one of the street lights. He was just standing there, not even pretending to hide. My stomach dropped. I didn't want to panic, but as I sped up, he started to move. I realized he was heading right for me and he was picking up speed. My heart was pounding as I fumbled for my keys, practically throwing myself into my car and locking the doors just in time. The second I locked it, he was there, banging on the window, his face inches from mine, staring at me with this blank expression while I screamed. And then, just as suddenly as he'd started, he stopped. He stood there for a moment, looking at me with that same blank stare, and then, as if nothing had happened, he turned around and walked away, disappearing down the street. I called my manager the next day and they said they'd keep an eye out, but that there wasn't much they could do. I still work nights, but every time I leave, I'm scanning the lot, terrified he'll be standing there again. I've been a nurse for over 5 years and I love my job. But recently I've been dealing with something that's starting to make me question if I can keep working at my hospital. About a month ago, I noticed this man sitting in the A&D waiting area during one of my shifts. I didn't think much of it. People come and go all the time, and he didn't look out of place. But I started seeing him more frequently, always around the same time I'd start my shifts. He'd be there when I arrived, just sitting, watching as I passed by. He never spoke to anyone, never approached the front desk, and never actually seemed to be there for a patient. After about a week of seeing him, I started feeling uneasy. I'd go about my tasks, but every time I looked up, there he was, his eyes fixed on me. He never did anything outwardly threatening, though. A few days later, I spotted him in the hospital car park when I finished a night shift. It was early morning, barely anyone else around. He was just leaning against his car, parked near mine, watching me as I walked over. I was on edge, but again, I tried to ignore him. I hurried to my car, not looking back, and left as quickly as I could. Then it got worse. He began showing up at the little cafe I go to on my breaks. It's this cozy place just across from the hospital, somewhere I've gone for years to get away from the chaos for a few minutes. The first time he was there, he sat at a table by the window, staring at me as I walked in. I was so taken aback I almost left. When it happened again, I felt my stomach drop. Every single time I'd go in, he'd be there waiting, his eyes never leaving me. By this point, I was genuinely scared. I talked to some of my colleagues, but they shrugged it off, saying he was probably just a lonely guy with nowhere else to go. But it felt more than that, like he was deliberately tracking my every move. He wasn't just some random person loitering around, he was following me. The breaking point came last week. I had to pull an overnight shift, and when I walked into the parking lot just after midnight, he was there again, standing right in my path to the entrance. I didn't know what to do. My heart was racing, but I managed to walk past him without looking up. I was so shaken, I went straight to security and told them everything. They promised to keep an eye out, but since he technically hadn't done anything illegal, there wasn't much they could do. Now I feel trapped. He's still around. Not every day, but often enough that I'm constantly on edge, always checking over my shoulder. I don't know what he wants, and I'm terrified of what might happen if I ever end up alone with him. I'm considering asking to transfer to another hospital, but it feels like letting him win. I just wish I knew why he won't leave me alone. I moved out of my hometown about 6 months ago, determined to start fresh after finally ending a relationship that had left me in pieces. My ex, Jack, wasn't just controlling. He was manipulative, obsessive, and had a temper I'll never forget. It took years to break free, and I thought I'd finally left him behind. New job, new flat, no contact, just peace for the first time in years. A few weeks ago, things started happening. It was almost like the little things he'd do to remind me he was in control. I get a text from an unknown number with a photo of me walking down the street or sitting in a cafe. The message was always blank, just the photo. My heart would race when they come through. I started looking over my shoulder and making sure all my doors and windows were locked. Then I started smelling his aftershave in my flat. Jack always wore this distinctive scent, heavy and musky. Some mornings I'd walk into the kitchen and swear it was there, lingering like he'd just left the room. I'd lie in bed at night, holding my breath, just trying to convince myself it was all in my head. One night I barely slept. I kept waking up, heart pounding, feeling like I wasn't alone. When my alarm finally went off, I opened my eyes to the smell of coffee. For a second, I thought I was still dreaming, but then I heard movement, a shuffle, and the clink of a tray. Jack was standing there at the foot of my bed holding a tray with toast and coffee, looking at me with this sickly smile. He just said, "Good morning, love. Made your breakfast?" I didn't even scream. I was too frozen to make a sound. I sat there paralyzed while he went on about how he'd missed me, how no one would ever treat me as well as he could. I finally managed to whisper, "How did you get in?" He looked at me, almost offended, and said, "I have a key, remember?" Then his face twisted into something darker. "You never appreciate anything I do for you, do you?" he hissed, his voice low and angry. I don't know how I managed it, but I threw myself off the bed and bolted for the door. He lunged after me, knocking over the tray and spilling coffee everywhere. I made it out, sprinting to my neighbor's door and banging until they opened up. They called the police and I stayed locked in their flat, shaking, trying to process what had just happened. When the police came, they searched every inch of my place but found nothing. No sign of Jack, no forced entry, no key lying around. It was like he'd disappeared into thin air. They told me they'd keep an eye on things, but it didn't make me feel any safer. I started sharing my life online about 2 years ago. Just harmless lifestyle posts, fashion, little moments of my day. It grew faster than I ever expected, and before I knew it, I had thousands of followers. It felt amazing to connect with so many people, and I started to rely on the attention and interaction. It's like it became part of who I was. But I never thought it would bring this into my life. It started with DMs and comments from someone I assumed was just a dedicated fan. He called himself Sam and would reply to almost every post. It was flattering, really. His messages were just shy of awkward, but still polite, so I always responded kindly. Then about a month ago, his comments became more personal. The gifts started. I posted a story from my favorite coffee shop, then he would show up, handing me a small parcel while I was at my table with a note. "For you, my darling." It was a keyring shaped like a heart. I went cold reading it, but I thanked him and he went off on this way. It escalated fast. One day I posted about a new pair of shoes I just bought, and the next morning a box was outside my door with a note saying, "I thought you'd like this pair better." Inside was a pair of heels in my exact size. Then one night I got home late after dinner with friends. I walked into my bedroom and nearly jumped out of my skin. There, lying on my bed, was him, Sam. His hair was a mess, clothes dirty and creased, but he was lying back, smiling at me as if he'd been waiting all night for me to come home. I was frozen, stuck in the doorway as he looked at me with this possessive, sickly gaze and said, "You're home, love, finally." My fight or flight kicked in. I stumbled backwards, slammed the door shut, and bolted down the stairs, not even thinking to grab my phone or keys. I ran to my neighbor's flat and pounded on the door, barely able to speak. Thankfully, she let me in and called the police straight away. I was sitting in her kitchen shaking and trying to catch my breath when I heard him shouting, "Don't kick me out! This is our home!" It took every ounce of strength not to scream. The police arrived quickly, and even as they dragged him out of the building, he was fighting and shouting, telling them they were separating him from his wife, promising me he'd be back soon. I've pulled back from social media now, keeping things as private as I can. Please be careful what you share online. You never know who's watching. I've been working as a barista at a coffee shop in the city center for almost a year now. It's a pretty chill gig, and I get to meet loads of interesting people, but a few months back, something started happening that has made me question whether it's worth the risk. It all started with this one customer, middle-aged, glasses, always wore the same dark jacket. At first, I didn't think much of him. We get a lot of regulars who stay for hours. He'd come in most days, order the smallest coffee we offered, and sit there for hours. No laptop, sometimes a book, but I noticed he rarely turned the pages. After a few weeks, I started noticing that whenever I moved around the shop, his eyes would follow me. Not the casual glances you might expect from someone spacing out, but a fixed stare like he was tracking every movement. One day I caught him holding up his phone in my direction, and it looked like he was taking a photo of me. It got weirder. On one of my days off, I went to a cafe down the street. As I was ordering, I noticed him sitting alone by the window, his phone out in front of him, facing me. I thought, maybe it was just a coincidence, but when it happened again the next week, in a completely different place, my stomach dropped. He wasn't just a regular customer anymore. He was showing up wherever I went. I started looking over my shoulder constantly. Every time I left the house, I'd scan the streets, half expecting him to pop up. My mates told me to stop being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me. Then last week it escalated. I got home late after a shift, exhausted, and as I walked up to my building, I saw a car parked across the street. It was dark, but I could make out someone in the driver's seat, staring straight at my window. My heart started racing. It was him. I stood frozen for a second, wondering if I should confront him, call the police, do something, but he didn't move. He just sat there, completely still, watching. I bolted inside, locked the door, and shut the curtains. I barely slept that night, convinced he was outside. The next day, I checked, and the car was gone. I haven't seen him at work since, but every time I leave my flat or walk to work, I'm constantly checking around me. I can't seem to relax. I've been working as a delivery driver for about a year now. It's not the most glamorous job, but it pays the bills, and honestly, I usually enjoy the quiet nights, just me and the open road. But a couple of nights ago, something happened that's made me seriously rethink it all. It started as a normal shift, loading up the car with orders, dropping them off, rinse and repeat. It was about halfway through the night when I noticed a dark sedan that seemed to be sticking a bit too close to me. Late night shifts mean empty roads, so seeing the same car a few times isn't too weird, especially if they're heading in the same direction. But then, every stop I made, this car would appear a few seconds later, parking up just close enough to see me, but far enough that they could disappear if I looked too long. At one stop, I caught a glimpse of the driver, a shadowed figure, face hidden in the dark, just sitting there watching. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, so I decided to test it out. On my next delivery, I changed routes, took a longer way around, thought I'd lose them, but when I pulled up to the customer's address, the sedan was already there, waiting at the end of the street, headlights off. I felt my stomach drop. At that point, I was on edge, checking my mirrors constantly. I tried calling my manager, but of course he didn't pick up. I thought about calling the police, but what would I even say? There's a car following me around on deliveries. I didn't want to look like an idiot if it turned out to be nothing. So I told myself I'd finish the shift and try to shake them again. I pulled up to my next address, and sure enough, there they were, parked just down the street, headlights still off. My hands were shaking as I grabbed the food bag and went up to the house, practically bolted to the door and back, barely remembering to make eye contact with the customer. For my last delivery, I took the longest, most complicated route I could think of, winding down back streets, doubling back, anything to lose this car. But when I pulled up to the last stop, they were already there, parked directly across the street, as if they'd been waiting all night just for this moment. The headlights flashed on, blinding me, and I felt like a rabbit caught in a trap. At that point, I was done. I didn't care if I looked paranoid. I called the police, parked my car, and locked myself inside, just hoping they'd arrive before anything happened. The car idled there for what felt like forever, headlights glaring straight at me. Just before the police finally showed up, the sedan sped off, just vanished into the night as if it had never been there. I tried explaining, but I could tell they didn't take it seriously. They asked if I'd been drinking, or maybe imagined it. I knew they wouldn't believe me. They said they'd keep an eye out and left. The next night, I pulled into my drive at the end of my shift, and there it was. The same dark sedan parked just down the street, engine off, headlights dark. It's been 3 nights now, and it's there every night when I get home, just watching, waiting. I don't know what they want, but I can feel that they're not finished with me. I don't know if I'll ever feel safe driving again or even in my own home. I've been a long-haul trucker for a good while now, and I'd say I know what it takes to handle the road alone. I've been through every kind of storm, dodged wildlife, and pushed through exhaustion on stretches where there's nothing but open road and darkness. It started on a typical route across 3 states. I was hauling a full load and had a schedule to keep, so I was making short stops at various rest areas, just enough to grab coffee, stretch, then back on the road. Somewhere around the second stop, I noticed this blue pickup truck parked a couple of spaces down, older model, a bit beat up, but not too out of place. I didn't think much of it, but I clocked it again at the next stop. Same blue truck, same few spaces away. There was no one inside from what I could see, and I figured the driver was probably on a similar route. When I got back on the road, I checked my mirrors more than usual, but I didn't see the truck again. A few hours later, on a dark, empty stretch of highway, headlights suddenly appeared in my rear view. When they got closer, I realized it was the blue pickup. It started to drive faster, gain me. Then it pulled right up to my bumper. It began flashing its headlights, just these bright, quick bursts, like it was trying to get my attention or make me pull over. I thought maybe they needed help or were trying to signal something wrong with my truck, so I slowed down and checked my mirrors, but nothing looked out of place. I sped up a little, thinking they'd pass, but the truck stayed right on me, flashing those lights every few minutes. That's when I started feeling this chill down my spine. I didn't know who was driving, but whoever it was, they weren't trying to pass. After another 10 minutes of this, I spotted a small gas station just off the road and decided to pull in, thinking maybe I'd lose them or at least have other people around. I turned off and sure enough the blue truck followed, parking at the far end of the lot. I kept my eyes on it as I went into the station, trying to look casual while I grabbed a coffee and acted like I didn't notice. I half expected someone to get out, but no one did. They just sat there watching. By the time I got back in my truck, they were gone. I told myself it was over, but as soon as I merged back onto the highway, they were behind me again. This time they started tailgating me, swerving a little, headlights flashing, like they wanted me to know they were right there, not going anywhere. I was getting genuinely scared. Out here there's no quick way to call for help. No one else around to see this happening. Then they started toying with me, pulling up alongside, slowing down, then darting back behind. I couldn't get a good look at the driver, just a shadowed figure in the seat. It was like a cat playing with its prey, waiting to see what I'd do next. After what felt like hours, I spotted an exit with a large truck stop ahead and decided that was it. I was getting off the highway, and if they followed, I'd find someone, anyone to help. I pulled into the lot, parked close to the entrance, and waited. For a moment, everything was still, but then I saw it, the blue pickup. It circled around the far end of the parking lot. Then it drove off, disappearing back onto the highway. I waited an hour, heart pounding, before I dared to get back on the road. And thankfully, this time, the pickup was gone. I don't know what their plan was, what they wanted, or who they were, but I've never been that scared in my life. I haven't seen the blue truck since, but every time I get behind the wheel now, I check my mirrors, half expecting to see those headlights coming up behind me. I thought I'd seen it all on the road, but this was something else. I went on a night out with my friends to one of our usual spots, and I started chatting to this guy, Tom. We had a bit of a dance, flirted, and he seemed nice enough. After some banter, he asked for my number and Snapchat, and I figured, why not? It felt harmless. We messaged back and forth the next day, just friendly, nothing serious. But after a few conversations, I started to feel like maybe he was a bit intense. I got the impression he was a lot keener than I was, so I tried to make it clear that I was just up for being friends, but then he started acting a bit strange. He'd message constantly, like every time I was online. He started sending me Snapchats from places I'd been. I'd go to a cafe with my friends, and a few minutes later, I'd get a snap from him in the same place. Once, I posted about going to the cinema, and within 20 minutes, he sent me a selfie from right outside. He made some joke about running into me one day, but it didn't feel like a joke. I knew he was using Snap Maps to follow me, but I didn't want to make a big deal out of it. Then, one night, he sent me a snap with the caption, "I can see you." I checked my maps, and sure enough, he was in the same part of town I was in, not far from my house. I'd had enough, so I blocked him, hoping that would be the end of it, but it wasn't. A few nights later, around 11 p.m., I heard something outside our house. It was raining, and I figured it was just someone walking by, but then I heard a knock at the door. My heart sank, and I don't know why, but I just knew it was him. I stayed quiet, listening, trying to convince myself I was just being paranoid, but then he knocked again. I texted my housemate Anna, who was upstairs, and she came down, completely unfazed, thinking it was one of our neighbors. But when she opened the door, she froze. There he was, standing in the rain, looking right past her into the house like he'd been invited. Anna isn't one to mess around, though. She told him to leave, and he just stood there for a second, staring. This time she screamed at him to leave. He finally turned around and walked off into the dark. I half expected him to come back, but thankfully he didn't. I haven't seen him since, and he's blocked on everything. I've been selling my art at local weekend markets for years, setting up a small booth with paintings, prints, and a few handmade pieces. I love it. It's a chance to meet people who appreciate my work and hear their stories, usually the highlight of my week. But a few months ago, something happened that's completely taken the joy out of it. One Saturday, I noticed a man hanging around my booth. Nothing too strange. People browse and don't always buy. But he kept hovering, looking at my work without saying a word. When I tried to engage him with the usual, "Let me know if you have any questions," he just stared at me. Eventually he mumbled something about the paintings, but didn't ask anything, just looked me up and down. The next few weekends he was back. He never bought anything, never really commented, but every time he'd come closer to my side of the booth, leaning in uncomfortably as he spoke, he started trying to make small talk about unrelated things. My clothes, if I was from around here, how long I'd been painting. I was polite, but kept it brief, as you do. Then one Saturday, he asked me out. He didn't say it in a friendly way. More like he was daring me to say no. He said he'd seen me around and that he thought we'd get along well. I declined as kindly as I could, but he didn't take it well. He just stared at me like he was offended. He didn't say anything and left without another word. I thought that was the end of it, but that was only the beginning. The following weekend he showed up again. This time he didn't say anything at all. He just stood a few feet away, watching me. I could feel his gaze on me the entire time, so intense it made my skin crawl. He lingered for nearly an hour, not looking at any other booths, barely moving. Finally he left, but I was rattled. Then he started showing up at other venues. I display my work at different markets and events around town, and every time, there he'd be, hovering just close enough to make sure I knew he was there. Once I tried to ignore him, busying myself with other customers, hoping he'd lose interest if I didn't react. But the less I acknowledged him, the longer he'd stay. He'd stand there for hours. It was like he was punishing me for saying no. One night I was closing up my booth alone, and as I was packing away my things, I felt him watching me from across the street. My heart was racing, but I kept my head down, refusing to look his way. When I glanced up, he was gone. I thought I was safe, but as I walked to my car, he appeared again, following me from a distance. I managed to get to my car and lock the doors, and he just stood there staring as I drove away. After that, he started showing up in places I hadn't even mentioned online. My favorite cafe, the little park where I like to read, he'd be there. It was like he'd somehow figured out my routine. I'd spot him at odd hours, like he was trying to make it clear that no matter where I went, he was watching. I felt like a prisoner in my own life. Then last weekend he crossed a line. I was closing up after a late-night event, alone, when I saw him standing by the entrance to the building. I was exhausted and on edge, but I tried to act normal, rushing to pack up so I could leave quickly. As I finished, he walked over and stood right next to my booth. "I just wanted to see you," he said, his voice almost a whisper. I could barely look at him, and every muscle in my body was tense. "You don't have to pretend you're not interested." I felt sick. I grabbed my things and walked away, not even caring if I was being rude. I managed to get out of there, but as I was walking to my car, I heard footsteps behind me, quickening as I sped up. I got to my car just in time, slamming the door and locking it, but not before he reached the window. He pressed his face against the glass, staring at me with this blank, intense expression. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the keys, and I somehow managed to drive off. I reported it to the event organizers, but they just shrugged it off, saying they'd keep an eye out. The police were sympathetic, but couldn't do much without a clear threat or physical harm. It's as if he knows exactly how to push me just to the edge without doing anything that would get him in trouble. I've been a teacher for years, and one of my routines to de-stress is a nightly jog through my neighborhood. There's something so peaceful about the quiet streets, the glow of the streetlights, just me and my thoughts. But a few weeks ago, something happened that changed that calm entirely. It started with me spotting a man standing at the corner of one of the streets I always pass by. I hardly noticed him. It's not unusual to see people out and about, but he was just standing there watching me as I jogged by. No phone, no dog, no other reason to be there. I felt his gaze on me the whole way down the street, and when I glanced back, he was still staring. The next night, he was there again, same spot, same stance. He didn't move or call out, just watched as I passed. My gut told me something wasn't right, but I tried to ignore it. But night after night, he kept showing up, different corners, different places along my route. I started to get this awful feeling, like he was waiting for something. Then last week, I was about halfway through my run, and when I glanced over my shoulder, he was behind me. He'd never actually followed me before, so I picked up my pace. But then I heard his footsteps speeding up too, and when I looked back, he'd broken into a run. My heart was pounding, and I was in full panic mode. I sprinted, taking every twist and turn I could think of, and only when I finally reached my front door did I look back and realize I'd lost him. I locked every door and window, barely able to breathe. The next day, I mentioned it to a friend at work, describing him in detail. Her face went pale, and she told me that he sounded like a parent who'd recently attended one of our parent-teacher conferences. A single dad, quiet, hardly said a word, but apparently he'd stayed behind after the meeting and asked around about me. I can't shake the thought of him out there, knowing my schedule, where I live. I've stopped my nightly runs, but every time I leave my house, I feel like he's there, just out of sight, waiting for his next opportunity. It was supposed to be a carefree night out, just me and my closest friends bouncing between clubs, dancing, and having a laugh without a worry. We'd planned it for weeks, a proper girls' night, and after all our work stress, we deserved it. But that night ended up being one of the most unsettling experiences of my life. It all started in the first club we hit. We'd been there for about an hour, chatting and having a few drinks. I noticed a man staring at one of my friends, Gemma, while we were dancing. He was standing by the bar, watching her with this intense look. At first I just thought he fancied her and was trying to work up the nerve to come over, but he didn't. He just stayed there. Eventually he came over, drink in hand, and tried to strike up a conversation with her. Gemma, being her usual bubbly self, was polite but firm. She said she wasn't interested. We were just out for a girls' night, no drama. He didn't seem to like that answer. His face dropped and he just kind of lingered for a second, not saying anything before he walked back to the bar. We shrugged it off and kept dancing. But a little while later he was back, this time trying to chat up another one of my friends, Leanne. She shot him down too, just as politely, but I could see the irritation in her eyes. He slunk away again, his gaze following us as he threw back his drink. Over the next hour or so, he tried to talk to each of us one by one and got the same response each time. By the end, it was almost like he was trying to go through us, hoping that maybe one of us would change our minds. Finally, we decided to move on to another club. As we left, I glanced back, and sure enough, there he was, still watching us. I told myself he'd probably give up and let it go, but when we got to the next place, we barely had a chance to order our drinks before I saw him again. He was just standing there, off to the side, not even pretending to dance, just staring, nursing a drink and following us with his eyes. At that point, it was getting beyond weird, and we were all starting to feel uncomfortable. But we were in a crowded club with plenty of people around. We decided to ignore him and just keep our night going. We kept an eye out, though, catching glimpses of him lurking around the dance floor, always keeping his distance but never leaving us out of his sight. By the time we reached the third club, we were well on our way to being tipsy, and honestly, we started to forget about him. The drinks were hitting, the music was loud, and for a while we were back to dancing and having a laugh. The man was still there, but the alcohol dulled the sense of him. It was only later that I realized how dangerous that was. As the night wound down, we were all shattered, ready to call it quits. We'd lost track of him by then, and none of us thought much about it. One by one, we got into taxis, each headed to our own places. I got into mine, waved goodbye to the others, and watched as they each disappeared into their own rides. It was Gemma who told me what happened next, and it still makes my stomach turn to think about it. She was in her taxi, almost drifting off in the back seat, when she suddenly felt someone sit down beside her. At first, she thought it was one of us, but when she opened her eyes, she saw him, the man who had been following us all night. She was so stunned, it took her a second to react, her mind trying to catch up with what was happening. She panicked, screamed, and told the driver that this man had been stalking her all night. The driver pulled over, got out of the car, and ordered the guy to leave. When he wouldn't, the driver actually dragged him out of the back seat and told him to stay away. Thankfully, the driver got Gemma home safely, and she told me all this the next day. She was still shaken, and to be honest, so was I. We kept wondering what would have happened if she hadn't noticed him, if he'd managed to follow her all the way home. The whole thing makes me feel sick, knowing how vulnerable we were that night, especially as we let our guard down. It's been a while since then, but I still can't shake the memory.